Lonesome Dove, Chapter 58. "Reckon we'll hear it when they fight?" Joe asked. "We won't hear it much," Roscoe said. "That campfire was a ways off. Anyway, maybe it's just cowboys and there won't be no fight." "But we saw Indians," Joe said. "I bet it's them." "It might be them," Roscoe admitted. "But maybe they just kept running." "I hope they didn't run this direction," Joe said. He hated to admit how scared he was, but he was a good deal more scared than he could remember being before in his life. Usually when they camped, he was so glad to be stopped, he just unrolled his blanket and went to sleep. But though he unrolled his blanket as usual, he didn't go to sleep. It was the first time he had been separated from July on the whole trip, and he was surprised at how much scarier it felt. They had been forbidden to build a fire, so all they could do was sit in the dark. Of course, it wasn't cold, but a fire would have made things more cheerful. "I guess July'll kill him," he said several times. "That Texas Ranger done killed 6, Roscoe said. "Maybe he'll kill him and July can save his ammunition." Joe held his new rifle. Several times he cocked the hammer and then eased it back down. If the Indians came, he hoped they'd wait for daylight, so he'd have a better chance for a shot. Janey set off by herself. She had seen the Indians first and had run back to tell July. Roscoe hadn't believed her at first, but July had. He had got off several shots once the Indians started firing. Roscoe felt bothered by the fact that there were no more trees. All his life he had lived amid trees and had given little thought to what a comfort they were. Trees had been so common that it was a shock to ride out on the plains and discover that there was a part of the earth where there weren't any. Occasionally they might see a few along the rivers, but not many, and those were more bushes than trees. You couldn't lean against them, which was the thing he liked to do. He had got so he could even sleep pretty well leaning against a tree. But now July had left him on a river where there wasn't even a bush. He would have to sleep flat on the ground or else sit up all night. The sky was pale with moonlight, but it didn't provide enough light to see well by. Soon Roscoe began to get very nervous. Everywhere he looked, he began to see things that could have been Indians. He decided to cock his pistol, in case some of the things were Indians. When he cocked his pistol, Joe cocked his rifle. "Did you see one?" he asked. "It might have been one," Roscoe said. "Where?" Janey asked. When Roscoe pointed, she immediately went off running toward it. Roscoe could hardly believe his eyes, but she had always been a wild girl. "It was just a bush," Janey said when she came back. "You better be glad of that," he said. "If it had been an Indian, you'd have got scalped." "Reckon they've had the fight yet?" Joe asked. "I'll be glad when they're back." "It might be morning before they get back," Roscoe said. "We better just rest. The minute July gets back, he'll want to go on looking for your mother." "I guess she found Dee," Joe said. "She likes Dee." "Then how come she married July, darn it?" Roscoe asked. "It was the start of all this, you know. We'd be back in Arkansas playing dominoes if she hadn't married July." Every time Roscoe tried to think back along the lines of events that had led to his being in a place where there were no trees to lean against, he strayed off the line and soon got all tangled up in his thinking. It was probably better not to try and think back down the line of life. "I can't get no sleep for nothing," Joe said. Roscoe was glad he hadn't had to go with the other men. He remembered how weak he had felt that afternoon when he realized it was bullets that were hitting the grass around him. It had sounded like bees sounded in the leaves. But of course it was bullets. While he was thinking about it, he nodded off for a few minutes. It seemed like a few minutes. Asleep with his gun cocked. He had a little dream about the wild pigs, not too frightening. The pigs were not as wild as they had been in real life. They were just rooting around a cabin and not trying to harm him. Yet he woke in a terrible fright and saw something incomprehensible. Janey was standing a few feet in front of him with a big rock raised over her head. She was holding it with both hands. Why would she do such a thing at that time of night? She wasn't making a sound. She just stood in front of him holding the rock. It wasn't until she flung it that he realized someone else was there. But someone was. Someone big. In his surprise, Roscoe forgot he had a pistol. He stood quickly up. He didn't see where the rock went, but Janey suddenly dropped to her knees. She looked around at him. "Shoot him," she said. Roscoe remembered the pistol, which was cocked, but before he could raise it, the big shadow that Janey had thrown the rock at slid close to him and shoved him. Not a hard shove, but it made him drop the pistol. He knew he was awake and not dreaming, but he didn't have any more strength than he would have had in a dream in terms of moving quick. He saw the big shadow standing by him, but he had felt no fear, and the shadow didn't shove him again. Roscoe felt warm and sleepy and sat back down. It was like he was in a warm bath. He hadn't had too many warm baths in his life, but he felt like he was in one and was ready for a long snooze. Janey was crawling right over his legs. "Now what are you doing?" he said. Before he saw, their eyes were fixed on the pistol he had dropped. She wanted the pistol and for some reason crawled right over his legs to get to it. But before she got to it, the shadow came back. "Why, you're a fighter, ain't you?" the shadow man said. "If I wasn't in such a hurry, I'd show you a trick or two." Then he raised his arms and struck her down. Roscoe couldn't see if it was an axe or what, but the sound was like an axe striking wood. And Janey stopped moving and lay across his legs. "Joe?" Roscoe said. He had just remembered that he had made Joe stop cocking and uncocking his rifle so he could get some sleep. "Was that his name?" the shadow man said. Roscoe knew it must be a man, for he had a heavy voice, but he couldn't see the man's face. He just seemed to be a big shadow, and anyway, Roscoe couldn't get his mind fixed on it, or on where Joe was, or when July would be back, or on anything much. He felt so warm and tired. The big shadow stood astraddle of him and reached down for his belt, but Roscoe had let go of all concern. He felt so tired. He felt everything would stop for a while. It was as if darkness itself was pushing his eyelids down. Then the warm sleep took him. July found them an hour later, already stiff with death. He raced as fast as he could over the rough country, not wanting to take the time to follow the river itself, but too unsure of his position to go very far from it. From time to time he stopped, listening for shots, but the dark plains were quiet and peaceful, though it was on them that he had just seen the most violent and terrible things he had ever witnessed in his life. The only sound he heard was the wind singing over the empty miles of grass. In the spring night, the wind sang gently. July had never felt so inadequate. He was not even sure he could find his way back to where he had left the others. He was a sheriff, paid to fight when necessary, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the slaughter he had just witnessed. Captain McMurtry had killed 6 men, whereas he had not even fired his gun when the old bandit was aiming at him. It had all seemed so rapid, all those deaths in a minute or two. Captain McMurtry had not seemed disturbed, whereas he felt such confusion he could scarcely think. He had met rough men in Arkansas and backed several of them down and arrested them, but this was different. The dying buffalo hunter had nothing but a patch of blood between his legs. Death and worse happened on the plains. When he saw the canyon where he had left his party, he stopped to listen but heard nothing. It made him fearful, for Joe's horse would always whinny at his. But this time there was no whinny and he saw no horses. He dismounted and walked slowly down the canyon. Maybe they had forgotten to hobble the horses and they had grazed away. Roscoe was forgetful in such matters. "Roscoe," he said when he came inside of the camp. He could see the 3 forms on the ground as if asleep, but he knew they weren't asleep because Janey lay across Roscoe's legs. The only sound in the camp was the sound of flies buzzing on blood. July didn't want to see it. He knew he had to, but he didn't want to. He felt a terrible need to turn things back, all the way back to the time when he and Roscoe and Joe and Amarilla had all been in Arkansas. He knew it could never be. Something had happened which he would never be free of. He had even lost the chance to stay and die with his people, though Captain McMurtry had offered him that chance. "I'd feel better in my mind if you stayed with your party," he had said. He had not stayed, but when he had gone, he hadn't fought either. He had done nothing but ride twice over the same stretch of prairie, while death had come to both camps. He had no doubt that if he had stayed with Roscoe and the children, it would have come to him too. The man that had killed them must be a fighter on the order of Captain McMurtry. For a time, July didn't want to go to the camp. He couldn't. He stood and listened to the flies buzz over them. He didn't want to see what had been done to them. Now, when he did find Amarilla, it would only be to tell her that her son was dead. And if he lived to return to Fort Smith, it would be without Roscoe Brown, a loyal man who never asked for much. The strange girl who could catch rabbits would catch no more rabbits. After a time, July took his knife and began to dig graves. He climbed out of the canyon and dug them up on the plain. Digging with a knife was slow work, but it was the only digging tool he had. The loose dirt he threw out with his hands. He was still digging at sunup, yet the graves were pitifully shallow affairs. He would have to do better than that, or the coyotes would get to the corpses. Once in a while he looked down at the bodies. Joe lay apart from the other two, sprawling on his blanket as if asleep. July began to gather rocks to pile on the graves. There were plenty along the canyon, though some had to be pried out of the dirt. While he was carrying one, he saw two riders far across the plain, black dots in the bright sunlight. His horse whinnied, eager for the company. When Augustus rode up with Lorena, the Arkansas sheriff was still digging. Augustus rode over the canyon edge and looked down. "More dead to tidy up," he said, dismounting. He had given Lorena Roscoe's horse, which had an easy gait, and was riding on the best of the Indian ponies, a skinny paint. "It's my fault," July said. "If I'd done what you said, maybe they'd be alive. And maybe you'd be dead, and I'd have to tidy you up," August said. "Don't be reviling yourself. None of us is such fine judges of what to do." "You told me to stay," July said. "I know I did, son," Augustus said. "I'm sure you wish you had, but yesterday's gone down the river and you can't get it back. Go on with your digging and I'll tidy up." He turned to Lorena and helped her down. "You stay here, darling," he said. But when he started down the canyon, Lorena followed him. She didn't want Gus to be far away. "No, I don't want you to go down there and see this mess," Augustus said. "Sit right here, where you can watch me. I won't be out of sight." He turned to July. "Sit with her," he said. "She don't have much to say right now. Just sit with her, Mr. Johnson." July stopped his work. The woman didn't look at him. Her sad eyes were fixed on Captain McMurtry as he made his way down the canyon. Her legs were black and blue, and there was a yellowing bruise on one of her cheeks. She didn't turn her head or look at him at all. "My name is July Johnson," he said, to be polite, but the woman didn't appear to hear. Augustus went quickly to the camp and tied each body in a blanket. Blue Duck had been so confident of his victims that he hadn't even bothered to shoot. The deputy and the girl had been knifed, ripped open from navel to breastbone. Evidently, it hadn't been enough for the girl because her head had been smashed in, too. So had the boys, probably with the butt of the rifle Gus had given him. The deputy had been castrated as well. Using saddle strings, Gus tied the blankets as tightly around him as he could. It was strange that 3 such people had been Canadian, but then that was the frontier. People were always wandering where they had no business being. He himself had done it and gotten away with it. Had been a ranger in Texas rather than a lawyer in Tennessee. 3 torn specimens he was tying into their shrouds had not been so lucky. He carried the bodies up to the prairie, laid them in their shallow graves, and helped July pile rocks on the graves, a pitiful expedient that wouldn't deter the vermins for long. In the other camp, he had merely laid the buffalo hunters and the dead Kiowas in a line and left them. "I guess he took Joe's horse," July said. "Yes, and his life," Augustus said. "I'm sure he had much more interest in the horse." "If you're going after him, I'd like to try to help," July said. "I got nothing to go after him on," Augustus said. "He's better mounted than us, and this ain't no place to go chasing a man who's got you out-horsed. He's headed for the purgatory this time, I bet." "The what?" July asked. "It's a river up in Colorado," Augustus said. He's probably got another gang there. We best let him go this time. I hate to, July said. He had begun to imagine confronting the men and shooting him down. Son, this is a sad thing, Augustus said. Loss of life always is. But the life is lost for good. Don't you go attempting vengeance. You've got more urgent business. If I ever run into Blue Duck, I'll kill him, but if I don't, somebody else will. He's big and mean, but sooner or later he'll meet somebody bigger and meaner. Or a snake will bite him, or a horse will fall on him, or he'll get hung, or one of his renegades will shoot him in the back, or he'll just get old and die. He went over and tightened the girth on his saddle. Don't try to give back pain for pain, he said. You can't get even measures in business like this. You best go find your wife. July looked across the river at the unending prairie. If I find her, she'll hate me worse now, he thought. Augustus watched him mount, thinking how young he looked. He couldn't have been much over 20, but he was old enough to have found a wife and lost her. Not that it took long to lose one, necessarily. Where is this adobe walls place? July asked. It ain't far down the river, Augustus said. But I'd pass by it if I were you. Your wife ain't there. If she went up to Arkansas, I imagine she's up in Kansas in one of those towns. I would hate to miss her, July said. If she's in adobe walls, you better miss her, Augustus thought. But he didn't say it. He shook hands with the young sheriff and watched him mount and ride across the river. Soon he had dipped out of sight in the rough breaks to the north. When he reappeared on the vast plain, he was only a tiny speck. Augustus went to Lorena. He had spent most of the night simply holding her in his arms, hoping the body heat would finally help her stop trembling and shaking. She had not said a word so far, but she would look at him in the face, which was a good sign. He had seen women captives too broken to even raise their eyes. Come on, Laura, he said. Let's take a little ride. She stood up obediently, like a child. We'll just ride over east a ways and see if we can find us some shade, Augustus said. Then we'll loll around for a couple weeks and let Call and the boys catch up with us. They'll be coming with the cattle pretty soon, but by then I expect you'll be feeling better. Lorena didn't answer, but she mounted without help and rode beside him all day.